Squad. Welcome back to Crime Squad Podcast, a podcast about Canadian true crime cases, both solved and unsolved. I'm your host, Natasha, and I'm so happy to have you, Squad. I have been busy over here creating new episodes, and I have news to share. Started a new podcast about advancements in forensic technology and how these advances are helping to solve cold cases. The new podcast is called Cold Case Solved: New Science for Cold Crimes. Be sure to give it a like or subscribe if this sounds like your cup of tea. But don't worry, I will still be bringing you episodes of Crime Squad Podcast. This is a story about a victim that could not speak. She couldn't read or write, but she could smile. She could make cooing, happy sounds akin to laughter. She was a person, and her life, although cut short, has made a huge impact. This is a story about Tracy Latimer. But before we talk about Tracy, we have to introduce the key players in her story. Let's get into today's case. Robert Latimer was born in March of 1953. He was born to a family of farmers in rural Saskatchewan, and in his youth, he moved to British Columbia for a time. He ended up moving back to his hometown in 1977 at the age of 24. It was there he met Laura, who happened to be visiting her grandmother in Saskatchewan. She was a teacher in Kitimat, British Columbia. Very quickly, the pair fell in love and married in 1978. They then took over the Latimer family farm. Robert and Laura had 4 children together while adjusting to the many duties of farm life. Tracy, born in 1980, Brian in 1983, Lindsay in 1985, and Lee, born in 1993. It's documented that Laura's pregnancy with Tracy was normal, nothing of concern. But on November 22, 1980, Laura went into labor, and over the next 24 hours, she experienced a very traumatic birth experience. Doctors did not inform Laura or Robert that Laura was bleeding the entire process, and a broken fetal monitor presented infant Tracy's heartbeat as higher than what it actually was. When doctors realized this error, they acted immediately and worked quickly to pull Tracy out of Laura with forceps. Tracy's heart had been too low, causing a lack of oxygen to her brain. After doctors ripped Tracy away from her former home, she was whisked away to be tended to. Later that night, newborn Tracy began having seizures. The Latimers assert Tracy received severe brain damage due to oxygen deprivation because of the actions taken by the hospital, but they declined to file suit to find out exactly what had happened. Apparently, they just weren't those kinds of people, but I'm not entirely sure what that means. The source I got this from is a journalist who penned a book about Robert Latimer, so perhaps he's saying they didn't like to ruffle feathers. If that had been my kid, you better believe I would have followed up and did whatever I had to legally to expose the error. At any rate, little baby Tracy was in dire need of medical intervention, and so she was put into a medically induced coma to stop the swelling in her brain. She remained this way for 8 days. I would like to be able to say I can't imagine what this must have been like, but I can tell you from experience how awful this situation is. My first son had a low heart rate throughout my labor, which resulted in an emergency C-section. He had low oxygen levels in his blood work, and later that same night, he came into the world, he was taken from us and put into the neonatal intensive care unit. He stayed there for 9 days, hooked up to oxygen. It was heartbreaking and scary, and I still haven't recovered from that trauma. Thankfully, he made it through, and he's now a healthy, happy toddler. But sadly, Tracy would not make such a turnaround. Tracy was removed from the coma, with the swelling in her brain having subsided. Doctors knew Tracy had brain damage, but the extent was unknown. She would be monitored over the next year. Tracy finally went home with Laura and Robert, and Laura recalls Tracy being a happy baby. But around 5 months of age, Tracy began having seizures again and was admitted to the hospital for 3 weeks. Doctors tried to control the seizures with a myriad of drugs, and finally they found one that would limit the seizures from continuous seizing to only 5 or 6 per day. The catch-22 with the drugs, though, was that while they controlled the involuntary movements and jerking associated with Tracy's seizures, they also made it difficult for Tracy to perform vital functions, such as eating and digestion. For the first many years of Tracy's life, she had difficulties with eating and digestion. Food had to be massaged down her throat, and she would often vomit. The Latimers would eventually receive a diagnosis for Tracy's condition: cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy is a disorder with a very wide spectrum of symptoms. The cause is typically damage to the developing brain, usually before birth. General symptoms include trouble with movement and coordination, speech and eating, development, and other issues, but there are so many symptoms and varying degrees of intensity. Tracy had what could be called a severe case of cerebral palsy. She was examined by an orthopedic surgeon named Dr. Ann DeSuze in 1985, who said Tracy had, quote, one of the worst forms of cerebral palsy and that she was totally body involved. Her total body was involved from her head right down to her toes, so all 4 limbs, her brain, her back, everything was involved, end quote. When Tracy was 4, she had her first operation. The operation was meant to ease muscle tension in her left leg. This was obviously a painful recovery, but Tracy made her way through it and healed well. As you can imagine, a diagnosis this severe would be difficult to deal with. No matter who you are, there is a certain sense of mourning that would naturally occur. A debilitating condition that would have to be properly managed, not just in infancy but likely forever, would be so far from what you imagined your baby would be. Let's not skirt around the issue either. For those who want to start a family in a certain stage of pregnancy, at least in Canada, my frame of reference for this is narrow, you're asked if you want to do prenatal screening tests. This testing will identify if your baby is more or less likely to have certain birth defects, such as Down syndrome, cystic fibrosis, spina bifida, and many more. If the results of that test come back as positive, you have the right to choose whether or not you wish to terminate the pregnancy. Let me be clear here. I am pro-choice. I believe a person has the right to make the decision that's right for them. When faced with this option to test in my own pregnancy, it made me wonder for a moment if I could handle having a disabled child. And I knew for me personally, I could. So instead of finding out the results, I opted out. For me, it wouldn't have mattered. But you are not me, and your decisions are valid, and I'm not a person who would ever pass judgment. Robert and Laura Latimer loved Tracy, but the undertaking was enormous. There would be so many appointments to attend, drug combinations to try, managing adverse effects, and trying to ease the pain of your beloved child. Not to mention, the Latimers had 3 other children to care for on their farm in rural Saskatchewan. And it was because Robert loved Tracy that he felt sorrow for her. He believed Tracy was non-communicative and in constant suffering due to pain. She required near constant care, having the capacity of a 5-month-old infant, despite the birthdays that came each year to mark her another year older. He had to witness his daughter going through all of this and having seizures multiple times a day, even with medication to manage them. Tracy was suffering from hip pain due to the scoliosis developed as a result of her immobility. She was 12 years old and had already been through multiple surgeries, and here was yet another recommendation by Tracy's doctor to perform another surgery to ease Tracy's pain. The same day the doctor offered the surgery as an option to the family, Robert began to think of other ways he could help Tracy. He desperately wanted to ease her pain and her poor quality of life. Even Laura had said offhand over the years to Robert that she wished Tracy would just go to sleep one day and not wake up. This would be a blessing for Tracy. It would be a merciful way to go. On October 24th, 1993, Robert, who had spent 12 days thinking about what he was going to do to help Tracy, decided he had the answer. Laura and the kids left for church, and Robert stayed behind with Tracy. He left the house and got into his truck, which he moved into a shed on the property. Then he went back into the house and picked Tracy up out of her wheelchair. He carried her to the truck and placed her in the driver's seat. He used rags to prop her up. He attached a hose to the exhaust of the truck, then put the other end of the hose into the truck's cab window, which was opened slightly. There was just enough room to wedge the hose in. He started the vehicle and then sat down in the bed of the truck and watched as toxic fumes began to fill the interior cab. He said Tracy began to cough after about 5 minutes, and then a few minutes later, he was pretty certain she was dead. He timed it just to be sure. He ran the truck for 30 minutes. When Robert was certain Tracy was dead, he took her from the truck and put her back in her bed. Tracy was only 12 years old and would have turned 13 in November of that year. Robert felt a weight had lifted. He felt as though he had mercifully ended Tracy's life, freeing her. He said nothing to the family when they arrived home from church. He said nothing when it was time for Tracy to eat and Laura went to get Tracy from her bed. He said nothing when Laura yelled for him to call the police in the hospital when she realized Tracy's face was an odd color and she wasn't breathing. Laura said, quote, I knew she was gone and I was so happy for her. I couldn't believe that it happened for her. I was so happy for her. I thought finally something has gone Tracy's way. Robert called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, also known as the RCMP. Upon arriving at the home, Corporal Nick Hartle noted that Robert appeared distant, distraught, and calm. He did not appear to have been crying at all. Corporal Hartle went to Tracy's room, where Laura and the other 3 children were gathered. He confirmed Tracy was deceased and made a recommendation to the coroner Tracy's body be autopsied. He spoke to Laura and Robert separately and informed them an autopsy would be conducted. Robert quickly interjected that he wanted Tracy to be cremated, which further suggested to Hartle that an autopsy was necessary. Tracy's autopsy would be conducted on October 25th, and the doctor performing it would note there was no obvious cause of death. However, Tracy did appear to have signs of carbon monoxide poisoning. Blood samples were sent to a forensic lab, which would later confirm this as Tracy's cause of death. And on November 1st, the RCMP would launch a homicide investigation. Robert Latimer was arrested on November 4th, 1993, the same day Tracy was scheduled to have her hip operation. When he was told his charges and read his rights, he cooperated. He indicated he did not want a lawyer present, and during questioning at the police station, he admitted to what he'd done. He said it was better for Tracy to be dead than alive. Laura maintained she had no idea this was what Robert had been planning, but did admit she was happy that Tracy was gone so she could now be at peace. If you're following so far, you might be sympathetic to the Latimer family. You, like so many others, might be thinking the same way as Robert and Laura, that Tracy was better off dead than alive. The murder of Tracy Latimer caused a giant divide among Canadians. There were those that believed Robert had done the right thing, ending the life of his burden of a daughter. But there were also people who saw this act as exactly what it was. It was legally a homicide. A parent killed their child. The media often portrayed this killing as a mercy killing, and this had large implications on the community of those who have disabilities and rely on caregivers. Let's get into the other side of this great debate. People with disabilities face not just trials and tribulations related to health and accessibility, but also a social stigma that paints them as somehow less than an able bodied person. In reality, people with disabilities can often live long, happy lives. The media, Robert, and Robert's lawyers often focus solely on the fact that Tracy was in constant pain and was therefore unable to enjoy life. Something that wasn't often highlighted was that actually Tracy was part of a developmental program at her school. To get to school, she rode a bus with the other children. She enjoyed going to school. Tracy was not just a vegetable confined to a wheelchair who couldn't feed herself, speak, or otherwise communicate. In fact, she had a number of things she enjoyed. Tracy enjoyed music. She liked to watch TV. She liked animals and being outdoors and enjoyed sitting in jacuzzi tubs. Tracy also responded to physical touch. She loved being hugged and rocked. This was observed not only by her family, but also by developmental workers at the developmental center Tracy attended each day. Irene Frace, a worker at the center, advised, quote, Tracy could not communicate verbally, but you could tell by the expressions on her face when she was uncomfortable and when she was relaxed and happy. You could tell she liked the interaction of being held and rocked by the relaxed look and the little smiles on her face. End quote. Another thing that was grossly overlooked was that Tracy had a personality. Laura kept a daily journal where she documented Tracy's daily happenings. And in the entries, it was noted many times that Tracy was happy. Laura described Tracy's spirit as cheerful and mischievous right up until the day she died. There were also entries that detailed how much Tracy enjoyed eating dessert, specifically lemon pie, and preferred meat and potatoes over spaghetti. Tracy took pleasure in having her nails painted and almost always chose the color red as her preference. For a time, when the Latimers were expecting their fourth child, Tracy went to live at a group home. Tracy was known to engage with other residents and loved the outings they would go on, according to people who worked there. Does this give you pause yet? Does this sound like a girl in constant pain who only suffered in life and was better off dead? We can keep going. There's lots more. Did Tracy have pain? Yes, of course. But like others with chronic pain, it can be managed. One thing that consistently came out during court proceedings was that Tracy, contrary to everything Robert said amplified his decision to end her life, was not actually in constant agonizing pain. Laura's detailed diary entries and testimonies from those that knew Tracy painted a different portrait. And of the pain, it was certainly something that could be treated. In fact, as mentioned earlier, the Latimers were advised Tracy should have hip surgery to alleviate pain. And it was this mention of surgery that tipped Robert into thinking that it would be better instead if he put Tracy out of her misery. In fact, Robert would describe the hip surgery as mutilation. Take a second to think about this. Does this mean anyone who requires hip surgery should just be killed instead because the act of hip surgery is just mutilation? Here's another thing. While Tracy was in the group home, her medical condition was recorded as being managed with medication, surgery, and therapy. In fact, a doctor who had examined Tracy early in her life had said she could actually live well into her 40s. Cerebral palsy is not a terminal diagnosis. Tracy was not dying because of her disability. Robert Latimer is on record admitting he has a clinical phobia of blood, needles, and bodily injury. He distrusts doctors according to statements he made. Does this sound like a man who had his daughter's best interests at heart? Or perhaps Robert was tired. He was a farmer, he was a father of 4, and he had a child with a disability that required constant care. Is this why he focused so much on the pain, so that he could justify in his mind why eradicating his own daughter was an act of mercy? Was it Tracy's suffering Robert wanted to end, or was it his own? When the case went to trial in November of 1994, Robert stood charged with first-degree murder. The murder was, after all, premeditated. Robert had carefully thought about taking Tracy's life, even mulling over the different ways he could do it. Among the other considerations, he thought about giving her an overdose of Valium, as well as shooting her and burning her body in a fire. He settled on carbon monoxide poisoning because he felt it was the most humane. Robert's defense lawyer tried to have the initial confessions Robert made to police about what he'd done declared inadmissible. He argued Robert had not been given the opportunity to retain a lawyer during questioning. The judge ruled the evidence as admissible because investigators gave Robert many chances to obtain counsel. Robert, who didn't much care for lawyers and also felt he had done nothing wrong, refused each time. He signed his written confession under no duress, without legal counsel present. The trial lasted 9 days, and Robert was convicted of the lesser charge of second-degree murder. The jury found it difficult to find him guilty of first-degree murder, likely because the defense team focused strictly on how Robert had committed to killing Tracy as an act of compassion. The judge sentenced Robert Latimer to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 10 years. Canadians had many opinions about Robert Latimer's actions, and it caused a great divide. Many believed Robert's actions were merciful, while others, such as disability activists, were horrified. The implications of the public deeming this type of murder as a mercy killing would be expansive. Those in favor of Robert's actions lobbied for his release, feeling he should be absolved of the crime. The case was highly publicized, and the belief that the Latimers were the true victims in this situation and did what they had to do was loud and proud. Just 19 days after Robert's conviction and the outpouring of public support, a 16-year-old boy named Ryan Wilkinson is killed by his mother, who then kills herself. Carbon monoxide is the cause of both deaths. Ryan Wilkinson had cerebral palsy. Media outlets received countless letters to the editor relating to the case that supported the Latimers in their decision to end Tracy's life. I'll read a few of them for you here. Let me know in the comments on social media how these sit for you. Quote, "Not a day goes by for the Latimers without the possible devastation of their family farm and their own futures. They've already lived an enclosed sentence for over 12 years, around the clock, for their severely disabled daughter, Tracy. For that, they have never received any thanks from the authorities. This is not a case of murder. Tracy's death was an act of love to release her from the most extreme form of unbearable pain." End quote. Quote, "Can we please get real? We're not talking about Rick Hansen, who wheeled across Canada in aid of spinal cord research. We are not talking about Stephen Hawking. We're talking about someone who's confined to a wheelchair and unable to communicate, who was facing life not only of immobility and isolation, but constant and severe pain despite her numerous operations. It is foolish to believe her life could have somehow been less tragic had she lived." End quote. And finally, quote, "Bob Latimer showed compassion when he gassed his severely disabled daughter. Unfortunately, he ran into a doctor who wanted to play God and resuscitated his badly deformed daughter at birth, and a gung-ho police officer and stupid prosecutor who were trying to make a make-work project out of the tragedy for himself." End quote. The media was certainly to blame for the language used when describing Tracy's daily life. Many news outlets promoted the idea of Tracy being in pain, of Tracy suffering from her diagnosis of cerebral palsy. They touted how Robert had sacrificed his own life to heroically end Tracy's life, and mercy was what he had shown. Mercy, but not murder. In the Ottawa Citizen, a woman named Shelley Page was quoted as saying, quote, "Latimer was viewed sympathetically, while his daughter Tracy was portrayed as nothing more than a wounded animal ready to be put down," end quote. And this was exactly right. Citizens who knew about the case bought the media's portrayal hook, line, and sinker. But people with disabilities and disability activists were shocked and horrified that there was even a question of Robert's guilt. Everyone seemed to want sympathy for Robert, but what message was this sending to people reliant on caregivers due to disabilities? Well, the message it was sending was that a parent and caregiver knows best and should be able to make the decision regarding the life or end of life of their charge. Any climate of permissiveness related to a caregiver mercifully ending someone's life as an act of compassion could cause other caregivers in the same situation to commit murder. In February of 1997, the Supreme Court of Canada determined Robert Latimer should be retried because his lawyers determined there was jury tampering in the first trial. Apparently, when selecting individuals for the initial trial, jurors were asked how they felt about compassionate homicide and selected based on their responses. The second trial was scheduled for October of 1997. Canada does not have anything related to compassionate homicide in our criminal code, so Robert was again found guilty of second-degree murder. This time, though, the judge decided to be lenient with sentencing. Robert was therefore granted what the judge referred to as a constitutional exemption from the mandatory minimum sentence. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison, with 1 year of probation to follow. The Supreme Court of Canada and the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal denied this new sentence and instead imposed Robert's original sentence. Robert choosing to end Tracy's life is completely unethical. With all legalities of the definition of homicide forgotten about for a moment, Tracy was a vulnerable person and Robert was in a position of trust. The argument Robert often gave was that Tracy was too disabled to ask for medically supervised euthanasia. But as others pointed out, by that logic, so too was Tracy too disabled to beg her father not to kill her. In cases of medically assisted euthanasia, the decision to move forward with this procedure should never be made by a caregiver or parent who, in essence, is in a position of power over that individual. Robert couldn't feel Tracy's pain, so how could he determine she could no longer handle it? Many people living with chronic pain have good days and bad days, but they live through it. Quality of life is up for interpretation. Tracy was well cared for by her family and healthcare team. So her quality of life was good, backed up by the evidence as well of Laura's journals and by other witnesses who had the pleasure of interacting with Tracy. Tracy's case was also presented as being the most severe form of cerebral palsy. However, there are many individuals diagnosed with cerebral palsy that lead full, happy lives. Charlotte Cooper attended each of Robert's trials. She is a resident of Stony Plain, Saskatchewan, and has an adopted daughter named Angela. Angela was in her 20s during the trials and had the same type of cerebral palsy as Tracy. Angela actually had more physical limitation than Tracy. Despite this, though, Angela is a huge country music fan. She loves it. And at the time, she was well known in the country music circuit because of the concerts she regularly attended. Charlotte was struck by how alike Angela and Tracy were, and she felt a sense of dread as she saw the public support for Robert's actions. Charlotte admits Angela's life isn't without challenges, but they get through those challenges together. Disabilities are not a death sentence, and a disability is not the basis for a life to be devalued. The Latimer case sparked a national debate on euthanasia and justice. In 2008, Robert was granted full-day parole, and he was fully released from prison in 2010. He was most recently in the news in 2019 when he applied for a pardon to have him exonerated from his conviction. He steadfastly maintains he did what was right, and he should be absolved due to the newly changed laws in Canada related to euthanasia. Ultimately, though, even if these euthanasia laws were in place in 1993, Tracy's case is still outside of the scope. Only adults who are mentally competent, meaning they are capable of making decisions for themselves, are currently eligible to access doctor-assisted death in Canada. Tracy was just a child in 1993 when she was killed, and certainly could not make that decision for herself. Tracy Latimer had likes and dislikes. She loved being hugged and cuddled. She lived with pain and had cerebral palsy, but she was living. Tracy Latimer couldn't ask her father to murder her. She wasn't capable of that decision. But if she could have, do you really think she would have? Well, Squad, that's it for this episode of Crime Squad Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Stay tuned for another episode released soon. If this is the first episode you listen to, welcome to the squad. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any episode releases. Until next time, stay safe and be kind to each other.